Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight for the McDonald Faith and Global Engagement Distinguished Lecture Series. You've called a good night. This is our last of the season, and we're very honored and delighted to have you here. Just to reintroduce ourselves, we're Faith and Global Engagement here at the University of Hong Kong, and we host these lecture series throughout the year. And if you have not found us on the web, we would invite you to come to our website to sign up for our mailing list so that you can learn more about the work that we do here at the University of Hong Kong. But we're so delighted that you are here today, and then also too to introduce our speaker. We're very honored to have the Reverend Dr. Michael Lloyd here with us today. I know this is why many of you have come, because you wanted to come and to hear. He is now the principal of Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, formerly the chaplain of Queen's College there at Oxford, but he's also taught theology and has also led at the University of Cambridge, also at London, many things, and also very well published. Recently, he has published on the topic of evil, theodicies. Also, he's published as well in this beautiful music that we just heard a few moments ago of Handel. And so perhaps in the Q&A, you can ask questions from a variety of things. But we've also heard today from him, so as we're able to hear at the Foreign Correspondence Club, that even here in Hong Kong, he's really had a lot of impact, perhaps in some of your lives. Some of his publications have really been of help to people on theology at a level that everyone can understand, which is no small accomplishment. And also, as well, his work really to try to create spaces in the university that would see a revival of the arts and culture, but also to bring things together in university. So for the topic tonight, we're very honored to have him come to speak to us on whether or not universities, such as the University of Hong Kong, might become a place for a new transformation in learning and for a new renaissance. So please welcome Reverend Dr. Michael.
Is that actually working, or is that just for recording purposes only? It's just for recording purposes only. The rest of you might prefer not to be able to hear anyway. But Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for your welcome. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's a great honor to be with you today. So I saw a cartoon the other day of a British politician being interviewed in a TV studio and saying, "I'm an old school politician. I only lie occasionally." People today, I suggest, are increasingly crying out for truth. They're getting fed up, I believe, with the post-truth phenomenon. They look at our political scene, certainly in the UK, where claims are often made with more regard to their likely effectiveness than to their evidential basis. They look at the gossip columns of their chosen news outlets and see celebrities who fall out with each other employing expensive PR companies to slander each other, to set stories running that will damage their client's opponent, with scant regard to the reliability of those stories. It's often impossible to determine which side is telling the truth, if either. But we're increasingly appalled, I think, at stories being unleashed more in the service of vindictiveness than of veracity. People are, I think, looking at what the post-truth phenomenon is doing to our society and to our public discourse, to the tone and tenor of our life together, and they're not liking what they are seeing. And they're not just not liking it, they are, I think, beginning to question the relativistic assumptions that lie behind it. The classic alternative facts maneuver is an example of this. When your opponents present you with facts that are awkward for your position, you don't respond by refuting those facts or by changing your own position. You simply offer alternative facts, which equates to you don't question their truth, you simply present your own. And the trick is to make your facts more emotionally resonant than your opponents, because emotionally resonant is the new true. Relativism has, I suggest, prepared the way for post-truth by corroding our confidence in the objectiveness of truth. But I sense that people are beginning to see that connection and to resent the damage that relativism has been doing. The British journalist Matthew D'Ancona, in his book on post-truth, explores what he calls the declining value of truth as society's reserve currency and the infectious spread of pernicious relativism disguised as legitimate skepticism. The infectious spread of pernicious relativism. That was published in 2017, and I don't think that it could have been written, outside of theology at any rate, much before then. I think it signals a bit of a shift, a bit of a turn in our thinking. And if you want evidence of a wider movement rejecting relativism, I would point to the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Cecil Rhodes, you may know, had really troubling connections to colonialism and racism, and those who formed the Rhodes Must Fall movement believed that we should not be continuing to celebrate people who held such attitudes. They therefore wanted statues of Cecil Rhodes in Cape Town and in Oxford taken down. The common argument in response was to say, well, we must remember that they were people of their time. We mustn't judge them by the standards of our time. We need to understand them in the context of their own. In other words, truth is relative. It all depends on the context. And the Rhodes Must Fall movement said, no, it does not depend on the context. Racism is wrong now, but it was wrong then too. Slavery is wrong now, and it was wrong then. Any slave at the time knew that slavery was wrong. It's not relative. So there's an increasing pushback, I think, against relativism. I'm not saying what I think about the statues, because I'm not sure what I think about the statues, but I do find it really encouraging that people are beginning to reject relativism. I don't find it surprising, because no one who's passionate about any issue, any cause, is going to be content with relativism. But I do find it encouraging. People are beginning to realize that relativism is not their friend. Relativism is not, for instance, the friend of science. Stephen Hawking tells the story of a professor giving a lecture about the Big Bang. And in the question time at the end of the lecture, an old lady got up and said, "Thank you for your lecture, but actually the universe is supported on the back of a giant turtle." The professor smiled indulgently and said, "That's very interesting. What's underneath the turtle?" There was a slight pause, and then the lady replied, "You're very clever, young man, very clever indeed, but it's turtles all the way down." Now, science does not regard the turtle's explanation and the Big Bang theory as equally valid. Indeed, it has set up criteria for how you can judge between rival hypotheses. Relativistic assumptions would be completely at enmity with science. Science is completely incompatible with unbridled relativism. So relativism is not the friend of science, nor is it the friend of the law. No court of law believes that the accounts given by plaintiff and defendant are both equally valid. The whole point of the court is to determine which is the more evidentially supported and therefore the more plausible account. Again, the law has a complex set of processes for coming to such a determination. A process which aims to be transparent and equitable. Relativistic assumptions would render that whole process null and void. That is not, of course, to say that just the process always works and that justice is always done. There is such a thing as a miscarriage of justice. We've discovered a particularly grievous one in the UK just a few days ago, thanks, notice, to scientific evidence. But you couldn't have such a thing as a miscarriage of justice unless there was such a thing as justice for it to miscarry. Truth really matters. Ask any falsely accused person. Truth matters for science, and it matters for the humanities. And I think that people are beginning to realize that it matters and to turn away from the relativism that undermines truth and our confidence in truth. But I think people are wary of just going back to a concept of absolute truth for fear that absolute truth will be imposed upon them. They are afraid that what is true will be decided without them and will leave no room for them. That's the sticking point for people, I suggest. Our contemporaries are rebelling against the relativism that's been the prevailing orthodoxy for a couple of generations now, but they're afraid simply to go back to the concept of absolute truth for fear that it will be used to oppress them or some other minority group. That looks to me like a paradigm shift waiting to happen, if only a safe way forward or back can be found. Might there not be a role for universities in finding a safe way forward? Might not universities help our generation to find the basis for a concept of truth that's objective but not oppressive? So people are crying out for truth. Secondly, I suggest people are crying out for goodness. Certainly people in the UK are fed up with politicians who, during the pandemic, gave contracts for face masks to companies run by their friends, despite the fact that those companies had little or no experience in producing that sort of product. People in the UK are fed up with politicians who, during the pandemic, imposed rules on the country that they completely failed to follow themselves. They're fed up with scandal after scandal in their political leaders, and, it has to be said, in their church leaders. As far back as the financial crisis of 2008, questions were being asked of how our universities could turn out people who were highly bright, but who seemed to value little else than the bottom line, who seemed to be financially tunnel-visioned, and whose value-free education seemed to have made the financial crisis possible. Jonathan mentioned that I taught in Cambridge and was chaplain in Cambridge. In the 19th century, there was an alumnus of my old Cambridge College Christ, a poet called Calverley. Calverley was fond of his drink. In fact, he wrote an ode to beer. And one occasion, he was in a bar, had too much to drink, and decided on the spur of the moment to steal the pub's sign, the sign outside saying what the bar was, and to run off with it back to his room at Christ's, hotly pursued by the angry bar owner and a dozen or so somewhat inebriated regular customers. He just managed to get back to college ahead of the baying mob and persuaded the porter to let him in and shut the gates behind him. The noise of the mob, however, disturbed the master of the college, who came out in his dressing gown and pajamas and said, "What's going on, Calverley?" To which Calverley said, "It is an evil and adulterous generation, master, which seeks for a sign. But no sign shall be given it." Now, that sort of behavior will get the attention of a university. Damaging college property will galvanize the college's disciplinary machinery. So, quite rightly, will any safeguarding issue, or breach of harassment policy, or plagiarism. There is a basic minimum standard of treatment of others that's required for a university to have a functioning corporate life. What tends to be missing is any positive sense of what human life is for, of what constitutes a good life, and therefore what are the human traits that enable us and those around us to live one. In fact, little sense is given in many universities that such a thing matters. And that, I suggest, is why students are able to go out into jobs in the city with no sense that there's anything that need obstruct their pursuit of the bottom line. The very phrase bottom line might suggest that there is nothing more basic, nothing deeper, nothing more ultimate. Is there anything we offer as universities which give our students pause to reflect that there might be other questions to be asked, and other values to be weighed? If we give our students a fine grounding in their subject, and if, even more importantly, we train their minds to work critically, to be open to but critical of new information, new putative insights and new arguments, we will have given them an inestimable gift. And I think we've been doing that. But if we give them the impression that academic values can be cultivated in isolation from other values, other virtues, if we give the impression that their ethical stance is a matter of private and individual preference and of no interest to the university, how far have we prepared them to live a life that is good for them, for others, and for society? Does it not shortchange our students and our society to offer them such a non-holistic education? In an article in 2022, the ethicist James Mumford tells the story of his time in a psychiatric hospital, being treated for bipolar disorder, and taking part in what is called a values clarification exercise. He writes, "Presented with the handout listing various values, we've been asked to circle the ones that resonate with us. Next, the psychologist, with a flourish, ventures an observation. Each of us, he says, has different values. What's more, we often disagree about our values. So he concludes, values are subjective, and our recovery hinges upon our willingness to choose our own values." He then comments on that experience. "Harmless, surely. Who would deny that it's vital for my values to be ones I've properly signed up for, rather than had simply foisted upon me by my parents, my teachers, my culture? But this truism, that I will be more likely to be able to live out a set of values if I've consciously adopted them, doesn't exhaust the sense of what's being said. My psychologist is implying something more radical when he insists on the pivotal importance of choosing your own values. When he claims that values are subjective, he's painting a picture of the world according to which the only values that exist are the ones we have created. To say values are subjective is to say there is nothing independent of our own minds that answers to our talk of right and wrong. It is to say that our ethical beliefs do not track a reality which is there anyway." And Mumford reports that the session left him feeling more depressed and deeply disorientated. So eventually he puts up his hand and he says this: "The care I have received in this hospital is superb. The support, the understanding, the empathy. I am treated by your team as if I have irreplaceable value. When I'm feeling worthless, you don't act as if values are subjective. You don't reply, yes, you're right. If you feel worthless, you are worthless. No, you and your team always speak and act in ways that imply fundamental disagreement with my estimation of myself. Valuing my worth, you betray your proclaimed belief in the subjectivity of all values. You embrace truths far beyond any of our mere preferences. No wonder people are crying out for goodness if they've had drilled into them that there is no ultimate right and wrong, and that matters of ethics are matters of personal preference. It's always easy to prefer what is more convenient for us. Ethical demand is demanding. And if it's a matter of preference, I would usually prefer not. Now, it's easy to bemoan the moral failings of our political and religious leaders. We all enjoy doing that. But perhaps we should be asking whether we have not created a climate in which it is easier for those bad moral choices to be made. And I use the phrase bad moral choices unrepentantly. And perhaps we should be asking what we as universities could and should be doing to create a different climate. Thirdly, I suggest that people are crying out for beauty. At a university, there was a dean who cared about others and showed exemplary behavior. I'm sure you have plenty here. One day, an angel appeared at a faculty conference and said that as a reward for her good deeds, God would give her a choice between infinite knowledge, eternal riches, or infinite beauty. The dean chose infinite knowledge without hesitation. Good, said the angel, and disappeared into a cloud of smoke. Everyone turned their gaze upon the dean, who was illuminated by a faint halo. Say something wise to us, say the faculty. And the dean, now possessed of infinite knowledge, sighed and said, "Oh, I should have gone for the money." Universities are in the business of knowledge. Those of us who run them spend a lot of time thinking about money, and we use the prospect of increased earning potential to persuade people to come to university, though that obviously doesn't work so well for those of us who run seminaries. But we spend very little time thinking about beauty. As I say, my experience is that people are crying out for beauty. That, I think, was part of what was going on during and just after lockdown. People felt the need for beauty after being shut up in their somewhat brutalist urban environments. And it seems as if a longing for beauty is behind the movement of young people away from churches that meet in conference centres to ones that meet in more traditional buildings. In 1942, during the horrendous siege of Leningrad, when there was deep hunger and starvation and instances of cannibalism, Dmitri Shostakovich was writing his 7th Symphony. When it was finished, there was a strong desire to perform it in Leningrad, in the city, the besieged city, even though the Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra had been evacuated. So they gathered the 15 members of the Leningrad Radio Orchestra who had died and called for volunteer musicians to make up the remaining numbers. The musicians were so weak from hunger that 3 of them died of starvation during the rehearsals. It was eventually performed and broadcast by loudspeakers to the German army outside the city. At its conclusion, it received an hour-long ovation from its hungry and exhausted listeners, who were profoundly grateful to hear their suffering expressed and sublimated into a work of savage beauty. The arts are not a luxury. They are a necessity. No account of human existence, let alone of human flourishing, is adequate if it neglects the arts. And therefore, no education is adequate if it neglects the arts. Universities need to remember that today, more than ever before. We need to remember that when politicians see the role of universities principally in terms of economic development. In the States, one governor is quoted as saying, "If I'm going to take money from a citizen to put into education, then I'm going to take that money to create jobs. Is it a vital interest of the state to have more anthropologists? I don't think so." And another governor has vowed to direct any future allocations to those portions of the university that succeed in placing their graduates in high-paying jobs. Shostakovich 7 says no. The arts and the humanities are utterly essential when all else is stripped away, when money is meaningless as it was in the besieged city, where life is seeping away and death is everywhere. It is utterly essential. We need to push back against the monetarization of education. And we need not to defend education using mainly monetary rationales. That's not the point of it. We need to push back confidently and articulately against the current political tendency to see education as a branch of wealth creation. That misses the point of education spectacularly. Or take the research published in 2022, which demonstrates that patients in hospital heal faster when they can see the natural world. Research done in the 1980s showed that the dose and strength of painkillers required by patients in a room with a window looking out at a brick wall was significantly higher than in patients with a view of nature. The number of days that the patient needed to be in hospital was also shorter. It seems that beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder. It's also in the statistics of analgesic measurement. It's enmeshed in the objective world. Maybe Plato was not so wrong to see beauty and truth as different sides of the same reality. So I was reading my goddaughter a story the other day when she said, "Uncle Michael, do all fairy stories begin with once upon a time?" So I said, "No, some begin with, if elected, I promise." And I was reminded of that when I was writing this lecture, because long ago I had to write a brief blurb of what I planned to say for publicity purposes, and in a rash moment apparently I promised to talk about A, what Christian scholarship can contribute to this discussion, and B, what universities could do to address the three things I believe people are crying out for. So, being an old-fashioned, old-school politician myself, in the remaining time, that's what I shall try to address. So first of all, what could Christian scholarship contribute to this discussion? Are there resources in the Christian tradition that can help us in these three areas of truth, goodness, and beauty? Predictably, I think there are. First, in the area of truth. By virtue of being a monotheistic faith, Christianity offers a single unified fabric of reality. Because everything comes from a single source, everything is related to everything else. Therefore, everything coheres. And everything that is true in one field is going to be compatible with what is true in every other field. There is one overarching truth into which my truth either fits or does not. We may not know how the truth of general relativity relates to the truth of quantum mechanics, say, but the assumption upon which science works is that they do relate, or that one or both need modification or replacement. The working assumption of science is that any true finding or model will be compatible with any other true finding or model. And that working assumption is what drives scientific research to discover how they relate. Grand unification theory or theory of everything. Monotheistic belief gives ontological grounding to that working assumption. That's the assumption, the principle upon which all scientific research proceeds, and indeed all cross-disciplinary research. There's no point in doing cross-disciplinary research if the different disciplines are not presumed to be compatible, and therefore able to shed different but compatible lights upon the subject being explored. It's this assumption, this principle, that makes a university a university and not a multiversity. Radical relativism would only permit a multiversity. Monotheism enables a university. But you may remember my suggesting earlier that though people are disillusioned with relativism, they're hesitant simply to go back to a concept of absolute truth for fear that it will be imposed on them by force. And here I think the Christian faith has something particularly distinctive to say. Because the Christian faith is based upon someone who did not impose his agenda on others by force. If anything, he allowed others to impose their agenda on him by force. So the cross seems to me to defuse our contemporaries' very understandable fear that anything deemed to be objectively true will end up being forced upon them. The crucified God is one who will not impose himself or his agenda or his truth upon anyone, and it ill becomes his followers to do so either. So that's truth. Secondly, in the area of goodness, if your Latin, like mine, is somewhat limited, might I recommend to you Henry Beard's book, Extreme Latin, which gives you all the Latin you need to know for surviving the 21st century. It gives, in Latin, some useful phrases for pupils when they haven't done their homework. Suo tracto operto suburbia extenso, canis latrans domicilium meum ingressus praescriptum domesticum mihi devoravit, which translates, I hardly need to tell you, to a coyote whose habitat was destroyed by urban sprawl ate my homework. Or, and I'll spare you the Latin, due to global warming, my homework spontaneously combusted. Or, my homework was forcibly recycled by eco-terrorists. It has a helpful section on small talk during a colonoscopy, including the Latin for, now I know how a Muppet feels. Sorry. And it gives the top 10 reasons to live in the time of the Caesars, my favorite of which is, si deum irrites unum, siscenti tibi jan superstint. If you hack off one god, you've still got 600 left. And I mention that because relativism is really a form of polytheism. To say that each of us should determine for ourselves what is true and what is good, that each of us should decide for ourselves what is right, should choose our own values, is really a way of saying there's not one God, there are many gods. If there is one God who loves everyone infinitely, he is going to demand that we treat every individual with respect, with dignity, and with kindness. If there are many gods, all of us choosing values to suit ourselves, our moral demands on ourselves are likely to be much less demanding. If there are many gods, each of us pursuing our own preferences, we're likely to be a much more fragmented society, which is exactly what seems to have happened. A religious education teacher once published a list of amusing mistakes that her pupils had made in their homework. Asked, "What is the golden rule?" one of her pupils answered, "Do one to others before they do one to you." And the golden rule of social media, of course, is tweet others as you would like them to tweet you. Christian ethics requires us to treat others as we would want them to treat us, not as a means, to treat them as a means to our own happiness. Having one God who values each person infinitely gives each of us an objective, infinite value. A value that we do not have to earn and cannot lose. If that were the bottom line of our ethical thinking as a society today, we might not have such a mental health crisis. And thirdly, in the area of beauty, I ought to say I've not always been a theologian. I once tried to be a self-portrait painter, but in the end it just wasn't me. For the Christian theologian, we are all of us self-portraits of God. We're made in the image of God. God is the creator, therefore we are creative. Our creativity is an essential part of how we reflect God to one another. It's an essential part of who we are and of who we are called to be. That is why we experience the arts as a necessity and not as a luxury. And for the Christian theologian, beauty is important because God is beauty. Now that has, I think, been a neglected aspect of Christian thinking in recent times, with the result, I believe, that many people have aesthetic experiences that are actually experiences of God, but they don't recognize them as such because the church has not given them the tools to recognize an experience of beauty as ultimately an experience of God. So the church has a lot of work to do to help meet these three cries from the hearts of our contemporaries. At Wycliffe Hall, where I work, we've set ourselves the modest ambition of fostering a new renaissance of Christian scholarship, leadership, and culture. Scholarship is really about truth. Leadership is really about goodness, or it should be. And culture is really about beauty. I'm happy to say more in the Q&A about how we're going about that modest ambition. But it's relatively easy to see what a Christian academic college like Wycliffe might have to say into this situation. What I want to do in the time that remains is to have a brief stab at answering the question of what a secular university like Hong Kong University can do to help hear and heed those three cries of the contemporary human heart. A secular university is not, of course, there to advocate for one particular voice, to prioritize one particular religious or philosophical or ethical tradition. It's there to be the arena in which the profound questions are fought out, not to be one of the competitors within that arena. It should not adjudicate on what the answers to those profound questions are. But neither does it have to adopt the view that there are no objective answers to those questions to which different positions may, to different degrees, approximate. The secular university does not need to adopt a relativistic attitude towards truth. If it does, it will hold science below the water. It will fragment into a multiversity, and if it is seen to have given up on there being any objective answers to the questions that everyone asks, it will play into the hands of those politicians who fail to see the value of the process and decreasingly feel inclined to fund it. Secondly, with regard to goodness, the same applies. The secular university is not there to prescribe exactly what values each student and staff member should adopt. But neither should it give the impression that it does not matter which values its members adopt. It should not give the impression that they're all equally valued, which is obvious nonsense, and which no one deep down believes. The secular university's equality and diversity training would make no sense if racist values were as valuable as and valid as egalitarian ones. No one actually believes that, and we should give up any pretense at believing the relativist assertion that one's moral values are merely a matter of personal preference. They are not. There have been hints, I think, that universities are beginning to recognize this. The Holistic Intelligence Education Alliance, signed up to by 70 universities, proclaims moral intelligence as an essential ingredient in a modern university education. The Oxford Character Project is not a university initiative, but it has touched a chord amongst students at Oxford and is now being run at many other universities. I gather you have an equivalent scheme here. Now, both of those had their origin in Christian initiatives and might not be appropriate charters or programs for a secular university to promote. But the Science of Well-being course at Yale University might offer a workable model. The program looks at happiness and gives scientific insight into practices that seem to promote happiness. What it doesn't seem to do is to look at different conceptions of what constitute a good life. A university that believed our moral choices to be of vital importance and believed that not all moral choices are equal, but did not consider its role to adjudicate on all the significant moral questions of the day, could choose to run a course on the good life, expounding different conceptions of it, indeed inviting people who advocate different conceptions of it to come and promote their conception full-bloodedly. It might even make such a course compulsory, as a way of saying how important it considers such questions to be. As a way of saying that it does not regard questions of goodness to be peripheral to its pursuit of truth and learning, but integral to it, and as essential for the training of future leaders in society. And lastly, with regard to beauty, there is much that a secular university can offer. It can take the category of beauty seriously, not relegate it to the incurably subjective terrain of personal preference. We saw earlier how the fact that we disagree about values does not make values subjective. I see no reason for thinking that the fact that we disagree about what is beautiful means that beauty is subjective. Actually, just as C.S. Lewis demonstrated that there is more consensus about morality than is often allowed for, so I think there's more consensus about beauty than is usually allowed for. As Oxford University found out to its cost when it put up some new houses that were universally felt to be a blot on the view from the beautiful Port Meadow. No one, literally no one, spoke up in defense of their aesthetic acceptability. Indeed, there was a lot of pressure for them to be pulled down before they were ever occupied, a pressure that was only managed down by the promise to plant fast-growing trees to obscure this carbuncular edifice. The fact that people disagree about beauty should not be used to support the contention that beauty is purely subjective. It could be better used to get us all to widen our concept of where beauty might be found and what it might look like. Wherever human beings have been found, from prehistoric axe heads onwards, it has always been a telltale sign of our humanity that we've sought more than functionality in the things that we make. We have always sought to combine functionality with aesthetic pleasingness. That has not always been obviously the case with university buildings in recent decades. There may not be universal agreement on what is beautiful, but that does not mean that the desire for our buildings to be beautiful should not be an important aspiration. We must aspire to the more than functional if we are to create an environment in which our staff and students flourish. Those who built the medieval hospitals knew the importance of beauty to the well-being of their patients. And just as I long for the church to resume its ancient role as patron of the arts, I see no reason why the university should not fulfill that role too. Why should we not aim for high-quality art on the walls of our beautiful buildings? Why should we not be commissioning new works for our university orchestras to play? If I'm right that people today are crying out for truth, for goodness, and for beauty, then I don't believe that universities should ignore those cries. As the Roman playwright Terence famously said, "I am a human being, therefore nothing human is irrelevant to me." It sounds like we do need more anthropologists after all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lloyd. Really appreciate this. And I promise that tonight was not a plant from the Faculty of Arts, but we did appreciate so much many of the things that were shared. So when we have our faith and global engagement events, we like to ask that the questions follow the ABCs. We would like, first of all, they to be articulate. Please, as you give a question, let us know what it is that you're getting at as quickly as possible, which leads us to be brief so that we can have as many questions as possible. And then finally, C, let's try to be centered. We know that this is a room full of brilliant people, but please don't disguise your brilliance in a short lecture. Please ask a question and be concise. So thank you so much again, Dr. Lloyd. And we'd love to open it up to the floor. If there's anyone that has a question, raise your hand. I may repeat it after you just because the acoustics are odd in the front. But does anyone have a question they would like to start us out with?
Hi, Dr. Lloyd. I am also from the Faculty of Arts, and I'm very happy to hear about beauty and truth and wealth and I have a particular question on beauty. I was recently very struck by something new, very new to me, and I was learning about different categories of beauty, like aesthetic beauty. There's sublime, and there's also picturesque. There's a lot of different. I could not find a word for that kind of experience that I'm learning suddenly. I learned how AI allows us to discover the structure of protein. I find it so amazing. That's something I relate to. That joy of discovery is something like beauty for me, but I don't know what's that word for that. How could I articulate that? Very new, but AI is also a very scary thing to me too, in a way.
I ought to say I apologize. I normally use hearing aids and I forgot to put them in, so if you could just repeat that last bit.
Yeah, it's more about the AIs, that kind of profound and spectacular scale of some discovery, which is not possible before, but now we could do that. I feel when I try to understand how that work, I feel the sense of beauty and some joy about it. The beauty protein is so complicated. It takes decades to understand one structure. But now we can actually discover like thousands of them. We can almost discover every one of them and can even create a new protein. That for me is so new and so spectacular that I don't have a word for that actually.
That's a very interesting question, and I think I somewhat doubt that we should look to AI for artistic creation because of the degree of novelty that is involved in artistic creation. It seems to me that AI is built upon a very, very sophisticated and a very, very useful sort of trawling of the past, recycling, effectively. And therefore, just as I don't, and I was saying earlier today that I don't think there is any intelligence, I don't think there's such a thing as artificial intelligence as yet, and I doubt whether there will be. Similarly, I don't think that there will be much in the way of AI creating great works. I don't think we're going to get anything of the stature of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony created by an AI machinery. But that does not mean that it can't help us in analysis, that it can't help us as a tool of a creative person. As the tool of a creative person, I can see it being hugely useful, transforming the ways in which we operate and the things that are possible to us. In the same way that the creation of a new instrument enables a new kind of music to be written. So I think technology has always supported the work of the individual creator, or ideally genius. I doubt it's ever going to take the place of that genius. Is that?
Yeah, I agree, actually. Totally.
As well as we're thinking of another question, maybe you could just add to this as well, at least here at HKU, and I'm sure many universities, Oxford as well, AI is really being pushed in a lot of ways. So how would some of the ideas that you presented today, how can we get into conversation with those who are really kind of putting all of their investments into the AI space?
I'm a big fan of AI. I think it's incredibly useful. The head of the engineering department in Oxford showed me a machine that they developed there, which is just a camera that you can point at a patient, kind of make it to the waist, and it will diagnose all sorts of heart conditions and other conditions simply by observation and measurement. That's a fantastic tool. That will save lives in remote places where you can't get doctors. It will be a huge help tool for doctors where there are doctors. So I'm absolutely not knocking AI at all. I think it's very, very important delivery. I just don't think that it will replace the human being. There's a reason why, from a theological point of view, why human beings are described as being in the image of God. I doubt we will ever say that of a machine.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, over here.
Thank you. So is a question about the fear and suspicion there has been in parts of Christian and indeed Jewish and Muslim traditions about the risks of sculpture, the commandment about not making graven images, all of that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think in terms of the commandment, it's about not worshipping them, and that's the key thing. It is not good to worship something that you have made yourself. It's smaller than you. We should be worshipping something that's bigger than ourselves because we become like what we worship. So if we worship something infinite, we will be expanded. If we worship something smaller than us, we'll be contracted. So that's kind of part of what's going on there. And then it needs to be said that there was the controversy in the 8th century about icons, whether they should be used in worship, whether there's a risk about that. And the Catholic Church came to the view that it was okay to use them within worship because you weren't worshipping them. They were not objects of worship, they were aids to worship, and they were sacramental. They pointed you away from themselves to the reality of God. And that's the category I would use of all art, that it can be, and every created thing can be sacramental. It can point us to that from which it came. It can point us to that which made it. It can be porous to the presence of God, and that's what we are trying to be. Every single thing can be like a stained glass window that if you put a light behind it, you see what it was originally made to be. We need to have that light behind us, shining through us, so that people can see the full colours, the full beauty of who we are created to be. That seen like that, I don't think there's any risk, I don't think there's any danger. We're not worshipping the thing, we're looking through it. A man who looks on glass, says George Herbert, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleaseth, through it pass, and then the heaven espy. That's what we want to do. We don't want to look at the glass, certainly not in any kind of adoratory way, but through it to that which, or that whom is we can see through it.
And any comments on the impertinence of the Calvinist view, for example, will go against the ideas from theological point of view?
So I think this is a historical question. I think he's asking about how some Protestants say Reformed churches in Geneva and other places were iconoclast, but not all Protestants. So any comments on why some Protestants were so iconoclastic?
I suspect because they have the reason that they would be iconoclastic was the same reason why the iconoclasts in the 8th century were iconoclasts, is because they feared that actually in practice worship of these things was happening. And however much the expert theologian was saying, oh no, we're not worshipping them, we're simply worshipping God through them and seeing them as that actually in practice it looked pretty much like idolatry. So I'm sure that that is the reason why they are iconoclasts in that situation, because they see it looks like idolatry, it smells like idolatry, maybe it is.
One over here and then one at the front.
And let me ask too, the mics are weak, so if you could just hold it quite close to your mouth.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the relativism aspect? Because there's different kinds, obviously. Ethnic versus, it's different than ethical relativism and relativism, ethno-relativism, and how that can be part of a new renaissance in higher ed. And, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more, since I think teaching certain kinds of good relativism is utterly important for our, diversity, etc. Could you?
That's very helpful, and I do agree with that. I think there are some good forms of relativism. When you travel or live abroad, you suddenly realize that the way you do things back home, the way you've always done things, is only one way of doing things. That relativizes your culture in a really helpful way. It's not always easy, but it's really, really helpful. You realize that there are a whole load of other ways of doing things, and that is a very, very good thing. It doesn't mean that every way is as valid as every other way in every case, and situation, but it does mean that we can actually live with a whole lot more difference and diversity and variety than we might have expected. So that's a very helpful question, I think. There's a lot of ways in which education relativizes stuff for us, and we realize that there are different cultures, there are different forms, there are different ways of thinking which we can learn from, which we can grow by. It's simply when you start saying there is no, the equally valid bit is the problem. They're all open to critique. and an evaluation. So you notice that I quite often use the word radical relativism rather than the phrase relativism by itself, and it's precisely for that sort of thing. So there's a story that's told of a lady who is having a dream, and in her dream, all the world's great philosophers come before her one by one, and she demolishes their entire position with a single phrase. Plato comes, she wipes the floor with him, and she wipes the floor with Aristotle, Aquinas, all of them, one by one. And she thinks to herself, I must remember this phrase that's disposed of all the world's great philosophies so triumphantly, and she forces herself to wake up, write down the phrase, and then goes back to sleep. The next morning she remembers the dream and thinks, oh yes, what was that killer phrase? And she looks at her piece of scrap of paper, and it just says, that's what you say. Now there's a sense in which that's really helpful. There's a sense in which whenever somebody sells us a line, it's helpful to remember, that's what you say, but other people say other things. Other intelligent people come to other answers, and therefore there might be something else to be said on this subject. That's all helpful relativization. It's when you start saying, move from the fact of pluralism to the ideology of relativism, that things start getting problematic.
Thank you for a very interesting and inspiring lecture. My question is, could you elaborate more on relativism as it impacts beauty? Because it seems the concept is much more accepted, tolerated, and not, shall we say, react negatively towards, because people have accepted that beauty is subjective as opposed to other types of truths or post-truths.
I mean, I do agree. I think it is the hardest one to see objectivity in, because there is so much diversity. But I don't see any reason for taking a different view in the area of beauty than one does in the area of value and goodness. And in some ways, I think we need to see that there's an objectivity to it. Some forms of art that are involved in exploitation, for instance, so there are questions to be asked about that. I just think there's a real risk that if you do not see it as objective, if you see it as purely subjective, then people are not going to take the whole category seriously at all. It's not going to weigh in people's thinking, in their financial planning, in their prioritization. And I think it's better to say, okay, so you think this is beautiful, I think that is beautiful. Maybe we're both onto something here. Maybe there is actually more beauty around than we previously thought. C.S. Lewis has a very interesting book in his Experiment in Criticism, where he suggests that normally in literary criticism, people have a kind of checklist of things that make a great piece of literature. And then you look at a particular text and say, does this have those qualities? If so, tick, it's a great piece of literature. If not, cross, it isn't. He said, well, why don't we do it differently? Why don't we look at people's reading practice? Why don't we see if somebody reads a book once and then throws it away and never wants to read it again, it's probably not a great book. But if they read it and reread it and keep coming back to it and keep wanting to look at it again, maybe it's got something in it. And so there's a kind of presumption from the way that people interact with it that maybe is trying to tell us something. Now, the fact that you find something beautiful that I don't. Maybe I've got something to learn from that. And maybe something I find beautiful that you don't. Maybe you've got something to learn from that. None of that means that it's not objective. It actually is simply a helpful way in helping each other to see what we're currently not seeing. It may be that I have a blind spot that you can help me cure. It may be that you have a blind spot I can help you cure. That doesn't mean that it's not objective. So I would prefer to go that route than the demotion of aesthetics to a matter of personal preference.
Thank you for a joke regarding truth, beauty, and money, and contrast that to the goodness, beauty, and truth. When compared those two between the initial introduction and your joke, I suddenly come to the realization of necessity to be addressed when it comes to university. Between the choice between money, or replace the word with the word power, and the necessity of goodness, because as we all know, when it comes to university, historically speaking, there has been research done in academia that have been used in financial and quote-unquote defense purposes, of which it deviates from human goodness. How do we reconcile that, and how do we reconcile with the alleged anti-intellectualism, which is basically to make knowledge more accessible, to make goodness more agreeable across the masses for those who are in university and outside of university?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have a particularly good answer to it. But the making it accessible seems to me to be absolutely key. There has been a certain snobbery in academic circles about popularization. And C.S. Lewis, who I just mentioned, was the victim of that. He was a very good popularizer, and a number of his fellow academics were quite sniffy about that and rather despised him for doing it. We should never do that. We are there to serve our society. Universities should be about the service of their society. And one of the ways is to make knowledge available. Another way is to make different ways of seeing available, to precisely the sort of thing I've been thinking about, talking about here with beauty, helping each other to see things that are as beautiful that we hadn't seen as beautiful before. Why should we not share that with the whole of our society? So I do think the popularization work is now beginning to be accepted actually within universities. So I don't know what the situation here, but there's a thing called the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, for which you not only have to publish and publish at academic level, but if you can show that you've had impact beyond the university on the wider society, that counts in your favor and not against you, which seems to be right. So I think it's about that. And academics doing TV programs about the history of this or whatever, the science of that.
Or the beauty of vulgarity.
Or, exactly.
Any others from the audience?
Hey, so thank you. So one question I had was, are there any particular societies or communities in the past that have done a really good job at sort of fostering a renaissance and a kind of like cohesiveness in a time of disconnection?
Are there any
examples from the past, like in history or communities that have done a really good job at fostering a kind of renaissance in a time of disconnection? So I think it's really hard. It's a really hard thing to do. And one thing I appreciated was that it's very forward-thinking and very constructive and kind of taking that on, rather than, I think sometimes these kinds of conversations get very cranky. And I feel like kind of, I read Alistair McIntyre, and you kind of get that vibe, It's kind of like, if only we could go back to when things were more kind of coherent, but they're not, right? We have to kind of move forward given the way that things are. So I'm just wondering, are there any communities, whether past or present, small or big, that give us a kind of a window into that, or a kind of roadmap for how to do that, or what kind of things or strategies, for lack of a better word, help us to do that well?
I think I would point to the 7th, 8th century Renaissance that took place in Northumbria in the UK. So you've got somebody like the Venerable Bede, the historian, I mean, huge intellectual figure, extraordinary scientist, apart from anything else, worked out that the world was round from the angle on his sundial, the angles of the sun, created tide timetables for all the local bays and harbours, incredible intellect. He wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people. There wasn't an English people at the time, but that book helped create one. It actually told the story of our past in such a way as to give people a common story and a common narrative and a common thread, in a way that actually created a unified and vaguely harmonious set of communities in the next couple of hundred years. So, I mean, I think that was a renaissance of new thinking, fantastic new art like the Lindisfarne Gospels, but it helped bring together what were previously warring kingdoms. And what happens, as I say, a couple hundred years later under King Athelstan is largely the work of Bede, who was the intellectual powerhouse behind that Renaissance movement. So I think I would say it can be done. It depends on the manner that it is done, whether it's done with an Irenic spirit in the way that... And he had his blind spots as well. Nobody's perfect, but he was particularly not terribly good on the British people as opposed to the incoming Angles and more Germanic peoples. But I think that's probably the nearest I can think of as a hopeful example from history.
I think we have one there in the back.
So this question is totally hypothetical. So I am impressed by your example about the siege of Leningrad and some musicians still try their best to play music. But what if in a hypothetical society, some academician, if they are still pursuing for truth and goodness, etc., it would cost them trouble. Should they keep silence? Totally hypothetical.
Hypothetically speaking.
I mean, I'm not commenting on political stuff here, but in terms of aesthetic achievement, there's always a cost. It costs. It's hard work. It's a cost of time that you could be doing other things. There's the cost of vulnerability when you expose your creative project to other people and to the possibility of criticism and having it torn to shreds by critics. There's always a cost, and there's always a cost to anything that we do in that kind of way. So I think in the aesthetic situation, one has to have the courage to let one's project be criticized. And if one doesn't want that, you can always publish it under a different name.
Thank you for your very inspiring. My question is, you called out for the new Renaissance, for reimagining the university, but the reality is that the banality is being celebrated. We live in
So what's being
banality?
banality?
Yes. We live in a world of mundaneness. It seems to be the governing trend. So in your call, do you feel that you are calling to the wilderness? Do you see other rising voices that rhymes with you? what's the reality check? That's my question.
What an excellent question. You're right. Banality is celebrated. So somebody once said it used to be thought that if you had, and it used to be said that if you had a million monkeys typing for a million years on a million typewriters, somebody would write the complete works of Shakespeare. They commented, since the invention of the internet, we know that that isn't true. Because so much of but we have this extraordinary technology, and we use it for the most banal rubbish, and worse than that, sometimes for really unpleasant communication with one another. All that is true. I remain distinctively optimistic because of the human spirit. Shostakovich was a human being. Human beings do that sort of thing. You can't stop them. They will keep doing things that are inventive, that are ornamenting, that are additional, that are completely useless, but beautiful. And I don't think you can stop them. Do I think that the culture today is encouraging of great art? No. That's partly why I'm giving talks like this. And that's why Wycliffe is trying to foster a new renaissance, to change the culture, to make it more nurturing of that kind of glorious activity. But I don't think you can ever stop it. And I think there are signs around that people are doing that sort of thing. So, for instance, in the Church of England, of which I'm a part, the last Archbishop but one is a really significant poet and was able to write poetry, write books on Dostoevsky while being Archbishop. I don't know how somebody finds the time to do that, but you just can't stop it from happening because it's innate, because that's who we are, because we're made in the image of the God who is the creator. So we are creative. It's going to happen. What we do need to do is to find ways of freeing people to do that with more of their time. We do need to create an environment that values that more than banality, that notices there's a difference between that and banality, and that rejoices in that which is complex and intricate and insightful and beautiful.
We have time for maybe one more question from the audience.
Just with comments about goodness. I don't think goodness can be measured scientifically. I'm a scientist, mathematician. I don't think goodness could be measured as such scientifically. I think a very good measurement is, as I walk up to the university from MTR, I saw a picture which the university has given an honorable doctorate to Mother Teresa. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the goodness.
It's a very interesting question as to whether goodness can be measured. The Oxford Character Project that I mentioned earlier has tried to do some research on whether character development can be measured. And they are tentatively of the view that it can, and I'm going to be watching that carefully to see where that goes, that research. I would be interested to know. But I agree that there are ways in which universities can at least acknowledge the importance of that by gestures of your sort. At Wycliffe Hall, the student presidents came to me a couple of years ago and said, we want to make Wycliffe a place where everybody is honoured by everybody else, regardless of whether you agree with them about things or not, that they are, the fundamental posture is that every single person is honoured in that community. And they've kind of gone and done it in a way that you can't do top down, you can only do bottom up. And one of the silly little things we do, if every week at our community notices, there's a gold award for somebody who's appreciating somebody else and nominating them for a gold award, which means that they get a little gold bar of chocolate. So it's not a massive prize or a massive incentive, but it's a way of saying, as a community, we value those intangible and possibly immeasurable forms of kindness, of goodness, those acts of where people have gone out of their way to help, to serve in some way, and that it doesn't go unnoticed. And I think it's important, just as in our ordinary interactions and human relationships, saying thank you is important. It doesn't do anything, doesn't achieve anything, but it's important. And that little ritual that we have every Tuesday morning, or your example of a university giving an honorary doctorate to somebody who's not one of the leading academics of her generation, but was a person of genuine goodness, is a way of an institution saying these things matter, and we want to celebrate them.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions and your attention. Let's give the Reverend Doctor one more round of applause.
It's been a lot of fun, so thank you for the questions and the engagement.
Thank you, everyone, and please do stay engaged and stay signed up. You can check more things to come at Faith and Global Engagement, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, everyone.